So tell the audience a little bit, I want to dive into your second and third books here, but I think first there's got to be some sort of a foundation of people are just hopping on here and listening. So when you start getting into this whole world and you wrote this book, The End Upside Down Thinking, Dispelling the Myth that the brain produces consciousness and the implications for everyday life. So what does that even mean when you say dispelling the myth that the brain produces consciousness?
It's a good place to start because this is a central idea in all of my books. It's it's the fundamental worldview that I now hold as a framework, which explores the topic of consciousness. And people throw that word around a lot too, just like surrender. What does consciousness actually mean? The challenge with consciousness is that it's very difficult to define because it's not something physical. I can't point to consciousness, but we all have it. So everyone listening to this conversation right now has a consciousness that is experiencing the listening process. That's the best way I can describe it. It's the part of us that experiences. It's the subjective awareness that we all have. So our thoughts, for example, our thoughts, if we just sit here and listen to our thoughts, our consciousness is the part of us that's capable of observing those thoughts. The consciousness is pretty central in our lives. If we didn't have consciousness, we wouldn't be able to have any experience. We wouldn't even be able to ask questions about the universe. We wouldn't be able to have emotions. And the big question that I didn't even know was a question until I started this research path is that science doesn't understand consciousness. Science knows we have a brain, and we know a lot about the brain, and we know that if you damage the brain, for example, let's say someone gets in a car accident and then has memory loss, we might be able to point to the parts of the brain that have been damaged that are associated with the memory loss. We can do this in all kinds of ways. We can do this with vision. We can find very tight correlations between changes in the brain and changes in the way we experience life.
Right.
So many scientists will say, all right, we understand consciousness actually because we can correlate brain activity with conscious states. However, this is the big assumption that they make with that leap, is they assume that because the brain's related to consciousness, that the brain produces it.
Right.
That's the assumption that I am challenging, and many scientists have challenged it as well. Why can't we make that assumption? I use an analogy from a philosopher, Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. He says, imagine you have a fire, lots of firefighters show up. You have a larger fire, more firefighters show up. There's a very strong correlation between the size of the fire and the number of firefighters that appear. So should we just say that the firefighters caused the fire? No, there's another possibility. And it's the same thing when you have correlations in anything. In statistics, they say correlation does not imply causation. You don't know just because two things are related that one is necessarily causing the other. So the hypothesis that I'm looking at is, well, the brain's is related to consciousness, but maybe it's not producing it. Maybe the brain is like an antenna receiver. It's picking up consciousness from beyond the body, which I know is a wild and crazy idea because the implications of that, I mean, that's big stuff. If we're a receiver, well, what does that mean for who and what we are? A more precise analogy that I use is to view the brain as like a filtering mechanism or a blindfold, meaning that the brain actually prevents us from perceiving so much in the universe. So it gets in the way. It's not the producer, it's the blindfold, it's the processor. It's almost like with Play-Doh. If you stick Play-Doh through the machine and you squeeze it out, it almost comes out like spaghetti. The brain is the processor that's taking this broader consciousness and it's giving us a particular experience. It's reshaping it. Right. And it's just a totally new way of looking at life. And that's the foundation of everything that I'm doing.